Hey y'all, Big Tim here again. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Old School and Bass with Big Tim. Today we're going to talk about my favorite setup, the bait casting setup. Love using some bait casters. They are the hardest ones to learn to use, so you might want to keep that in mind. If you want to try to use one, know that it's going to be a challenge. I got my first one on my 10th birthday. I can't tell you how long it took me. I can't remember back that far. Um, I do remember getting it. It was a Daiwa PMF-10. I don't know why I remember that, but I can tell you it did take me a while to learn to use it. Now, for those of you that are wanting to start out learning to use a baitcaster, like we said the other day, the best line to use to start out with is monofilament. It's cheaper, which is always a plus. It doesn't come off the reel as quickly, so it won't backlash as easily. And when it does backlash, it's a little bit more forgiving. You can kind of pick the tangles out. So today we're going to talk about basics of the baitcaster. We'll get later on. We'll get into different rod setups and everything else. But today we're just going to basically talk about getting you started using a baitcaster. Okay. So the first thing to think about with a baitcaster is this is the cast button right here. Generally, it's on the thumb. Some of them are on the sides. But you push the cast button and your spool will drop. Now, you want your thumb to glide across that spool the entire time you're casting. You press it really hard, the line isn't going to go anywhere. You're not going to make a long cast. But if you let your thumb off of it, you're going to backlash. And a lot of people think that when you cast with a baitcaster, you let your thumb off until you want that. I'm trying to get in here where you can see it a little bit. But that you want your thumb off the spool until you want to stop it. And that is not right. Your thumb basically wants to feather that spool the whole time that the lure's in the air. From the moment you let it go till the time it hits the water. Okay? If you learn to feather that spool correctly, not too heavy, not too light, you won't backlash and you'll make a nice long cast. There are times that you can take your thumb all the way off the spool, but for all intents and purposes, you need to learn to feather it. I tell people to practice in their room. You can do it in the house. Just take a 3/8 ounce lure. For this deal, I'm using a jig. It's 3/8, but it's a little heavier because it has a trailer on it. But you just practice in the house. You click the button and let the line out and get a feel for what it feels like with the spool feathering on your thumb. Okay? Once you've done that, once you understand what it feels like to have the line feathering across your thumb, the next adjustment you want to make is this knob right here. That knob is the tension knob. That controls how fast the spool moves. Okay? For beginners, you're going to want the line to just barely sink. And what you'll do is you'll tighten that knob down to where your lure will just barely sink. Okay? You may even have to wiggle it a little bit. And that's fine and dandy. That's the best way to learn. You're not going to backlash as easily. Now, the way I fish with, doing a lot of pitching, your spool has to be very loose. Well, here's the way mine works. You can watch the lure there. It has to be really loose to pitch. But setting it up like that is also going to make you backlash a lot more. So make sure that you set your spool up so it's not coming off, or it's not what we call free spool. It's got a little tension behind it, and you have to work to whip the bait out there. Your basic cast is going to be an overhand cast. It's hard to show in the room. We're going to talk more about that later on once the weather breaks and it gets a little warmer outside. But the tension knob is going to be your best friend. Learn to tighten that down, and as you get better, you can back it off. That's like me. Right now, I generally don't turn the tensions on hardly at all. I barely turn tensions on, depending on what I'm doing. For pitching, which is what I do the most, the tension is really loose. So spool up with some monofilament. When I say cheap monofilament, there's those cheap $2 monofilaments. No, I don't recommend anything like that. Get, some decent monofilament. You're going to pay about $7-8, maybe $6. I don't know. Trilene, Stren, Suffix, something like those, and spool up. You generally want to spool up with something 12 to 17 pounds starting out. The higher the line diameter, or the higher the pound test, the less likely you are to backlash, because it comes off the reel slower and you won't backlash. I know it's heavy line for fishing. Now granted, I use a lot of 12-pound line, but most people around here, they are not going to use 17-pound line for their everyday fishing. But I'll tell you, the first thing we want to do is get you comfortable with using your baitcaster. So we don't need to be comfortable with the line just yet. Let's get comfortable with the casting. Then you can dial the line down once you get a little bit more proficient with the baitcaster. Okay, so that's a tension knob. Make sure you turn that dude up, and make your lure just barely sink. The next thing is right under the handle here. This is what you call your star drag. The star drag depends on what you're doing, how you want to tighten it. With most of my fishing, I do flipping and pitching, so I tighten that dude down almost as much as I can get it. Now keep in mind, if you tighten it too much, you're going to break line. And we talked the other day that if we're using braid for topwater, like that's what this setup is for, you want to loosen that drag. And when you loosen the drag, what that means is the fish is going to be able to pull line away from you when the cast button is engaged. That'll allow those baits that have treble hooks on them not to pull free out of the fish's mouth. So you will adjust your drag. I'm not going to say on a regular basis, not like you do on a spinning reel, but you will need to adjust your drag occasionally. The next thing is, a lot of reels have a side plate that has a dial on it. That dial is fine tuning. Okay, this reel happens to not have that. I don't think I have one in here that does. But the fine tuning is basically after you get it dialed in where you're backlashing and maybe you got a couple feet of what we call professional overrun, but you got a couple of loose feet of tangle, you dial that brake system in. That's generally a centrifugal brake system, and it works a lot of times off of magnets. Sometimes they're centripetal, where they have brakes on the inside, but most of the time they're magnets. So with those magnets, you want to generally start, I tell everybody to start at 0. That way you've got a pretty good shot of dialing it in a little better. Other people will tell you to start at 5 and then turn it up and turn it down. I like to start at 0. The reason you want to start at 0 when you're dialing that brake system in is because if you learn to adjust this, you may not need the side braking at all. Maybe just to tweak it. So it's a lot easier to tweak it up than it is down, and so on and so forth. So that's it in a nutshell about baitcasters. We're going to get into a little bit more of the setups, rods, what rods go with what, the gear ratios. No, you know what? We're going to go ahead and talk about that now. One thing is, when you're going out to buy your new bait casting setup, these reel companies have gotten to the point where they realize that guys are buying their reels, guys and girls, sorry, ladies, that people are buying their reels based upon how many bearings they have. Let me tell you, that's not always the good sign. Having more bearings is not always the best. One reel company, who I won't mention, makes some of the best reels in the world, uses fewer bearings than anybody. That's because they make the best bearings and they put them in the right places. But I've seen some reels out there that they'll say they'll have 12 bearings. Well, that's because they stack 3 of them in each one of these paddles. So there's 6 bearings right there. Do you really think you need all those bearings? No, you really don't. But they're there. They're definitely there. That's how they can tell you that they've got 12 bearings. You don't need all of those bearings. It's better to have a good bearing than quantity. The other thing is gear ratio. We talk a lot about gear ratio in baitcasters. So with gear ratio, basically, it's kind of misleading because the gear ratio also depends on the diameter of the spool. But the bottom line is gear ratio usually is a direct correlation to inches of line every time you turn the handle. To me, that's the most important. That's what we want to talk about. How many inches of line do I reel in every time I crank the handle one time? So that, to me, that's more important than gear ratio. But we'll talk gear ratio since that's what everybody's used to. For the most part, the higher number, like a 9-to-1, 8-to-1, those are going to be quicker reels. Those are going to make your bait move more quickly through the water. Quicker gear ratios are better suited for, I like them for flipping and pitching. They're also better suited for some topwater lures, buzz baits, stuff like that. So anywhere from a 7, 8-to-1 would be perfect for topwaters, pitching, flipping, things like that. Now for cranking, you might want to drop down to a 6-to-1 gear ratio. Now there's 6.1, 6.4 to 1. I'm just going to make it general and call it 6-to-1 gear ratio. 6-to-1 will get you, it should be the number one combo to start out with, but for some reason we've made 7-to-1s the most popular now. But 6-to-1 is a kind of a good all-purpose gear ratio. You can use it for crankbaits, you can use it for spinnerbaits, all of those kinds of moving baits. You can also pitch and flip with it. So they can be very handy. The next gear ratio that you'll see, and this is getting harder to find because even though the manufacturers know about it, tackle companies or tackle stores aren't selling the slower gear ratios, like the 5-to-1 gear ratios. Heck, I've even got one somewhere around here that has a 4-to-1 gear ratio. The slower gear ratios are for the crankbaits, the deeper crankbaits. Those crankbaits that are getting down to, say, 12 plus feet or 15 feet, you definitely want a slower gear ratio. There's a Strike King, what is it, the 10. It's not a Series 10, but anyway, it's a giant crankbait. That 4-to-1 gear ratio on that is perfect. And the reason that it's so good for that big giant crankbait is because it's like trying to ride a 10-speed bike going uphill and you got your gears all the way cranked. It's just too hard to reel. It will wear you out physically, okay? So the bigger lures that have a lot of drag on them, sometimes big spinner baits, anything that has a lot of drag to it will be better suited for those lower gear ratio reels. So tune in next time. We're going to talk more about different setups and everything else. We're going to start talking about some of the high school fishing. I've done some research on where some of the high school tournaments are, and we're going to start getting more into lures. So thanks for tuning in, and until next time, have fun and good fishing.